Good morning again, everybody. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thank you for, for this crisp morning, for the folks that you've brought here today, and also I would ask you to watch over those that are not here. Today, I ask that your Spirit would move, and I feel like, Lord, that you already are. I pray that you would teach us today and not leave us the same. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Today we have a guest speaker. As I said, I'll give a little introduction, which I will do. But first I want to tell you a little story. Some years ago when I was in the Air Force, I got to do some pretty cool stuff and travel the world. And one of my jobs, I got to go to Israel a few times. And, I wasn't a pastor and I was barely a Christian, but it was quite moving. And you learn some things when you're there that you might not just know, even if you went to church for 40 or 50 years. And one of them is that the word Gethsemane, we know that word because the Garden of Gethsemane, right, where Jesus was praying and crushed, it says. It means the place of the olive press. The place of the olive press. And, I moved recently a lot, just kind of things, some of the things I've been going through. What comes out of us when we're crushed? What comes out of us when we're crushed? See, the thing is that God is not willing to leave us alone. He doesn't want us to stay the same. He wants us to be different. He wants us to become who he wants to be. In my personal Bible study yesterday, I was in Ezekiel somewhere, and it was talking about just how he just puts the flame on the silver, and he just keeps scraping away the dross, scraping it away. And, of course, that slag is worthless. And it says that slag is worthless. It means nothing. It's the pure silver that he wants. So I want to read you a verse. This is Jesus says, in anguish he prayed, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Luke 22:4. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying in anguish. Another verse for you, it says this, John 1:29, and surely there he took up the sin of the world. What comes out of Christ-like people when they are crushed is good. It's what should come out. When I get crushed often, it's not good. Just the opposite comes out. And so my last verse is this. It says, Isaiah 53:4-5, that he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We're doing a sermon series, just came out of nowhere, I guess, or maybe the Lord led me to do it, but I wrote it on my whiteboard some time ago. Is he enough? It's on the back of my door. You can go and see if you want. It says, is he enough? I wrote some other things too, but I've left it up there for some period of time, and actually it has developed into kind of a thought process. So I've said, hey, listen, is Jesus really enough when it goes bad? Are we Christians? Are we strong enough in our faith to actually know that he can still help us, that he's our only hope? And so as I was trying to put it together, I started to realize that I don't really want to preach this sermon. It's not a series at all. In fact, I think what we should do is to get people to come up and tell their stories of when they weren't sure that God would be enough. Or maybe they didn't know God at all. So last week we had my friend Dr. Sue Adams and her husband. He's kind of like a child, like most of us husbands are. And, I've known them for 20 some odd years, and they're great friends. John and I did ministry forever. But when he sat up here with his wife, and you guys who were here know it, the story is their 8-month-old daughter, their fourth child, their only little girl, crawled into their swimming pool. And she had been in there for quite some time. And when he said, at the moment that they realized that their little girl had drowned, I mean, I just got this thing that happened in my heart. It's like, can you imagine that feeling? The fear, the incredible just dread, I can't even imagine, and how he cried out to God instantly. Well, that's the kind of stories that I'm hoping that we will tell about how God was enough. Today I want to introduce a young lady, and the reason why I asked her to do this, and she is not happy about it, she's about ready to throw up right now, she's super nervous, she doesn't do any public speaking, but the reason is because you've heard from her husband several times, and you've heard from her husband talk about how he drug his wife through hell when he was addicted to drugs. And so we got to hear his story many times, but I'm like, who's ever heard her side of the story? Because it's a whole different picture, right? And so today I'm going to introduce John Sefic, but really his wife, Jessica. And she's going to come up here and she's going to tell her story. As they come up, I'll tell you, I met Jessica, and she'll tell you in the story, because Johnny asked me to come over to their house one night. And when I got there, she didn't look like she really wanted to talk to me. So some preacher is coming over, right? But we did become friends, and she became a babysitter for our children, for our littlest girls, who are now no longer needing babysitters. And then when we started this church, I asked Jessica and kind of challenged her to come here and help us with the daycare, because we're going to start a daycare, and she reluctantly agreed. And then we went through about 4 directors, and one day I said, hey, I want you to be the director. And she said, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, we'll send you to the school to do it. And so she's been our director for actually several years and doing a kicker job. Jessica Sefic.
Okay, so like you said, I hate public speaking. And on Monday, we were, I think, eating lunch with Susan. And I was like, who's going Sunday? And he just pointed at me. And I'm like, I wasn't expecting. So he asked me to tell how God's love was enough for me. And also, I'm probably going to look down at the paper because I hate public speaking and I'll forget everything I'm going to say. So growing up, God was never mentioned in my home, ever. Like, I remember going to church maybe one time, and I think it was for like a wedding. I remember my grandpa reading the Bible, and my grandma, when we would stay the night, would pray with us at night. But other than that, I knew nothing about it. When I was 11 years old, my mom and stepdad sat my brother and I down to tell us our father had died, and he had hung himself. It's a picture of him. He had struggled with drugs and alcohol, but I don't think I really could wrap my head around it. Like, why would my father leave? I remember I was his only little girl, and I remember him telling me I was so special to him because I was his only little girl. It was just my brother and me. But if I was so special, why would he leave me? Was I not enough to keep him here? Because I needed my dad. I see it often that people take their parents for granted, but I think today I struggle more with it than I did then, because I see more now where my dad should be here than then. You know, my dad, we are married, but one day I want to have a big wedding, and my dad won't be there to walk me down the aisle. He's not there for me to call. But this is really when all my struggles started. I became very defiant at 11 years old. I butted heads with my stepdad daily, and it got to the point where we hated each other. He would purposely go out of his way to make my life hell. This only made me angrier and more rebellious. When I was 15 years old, my grandpa had a massive heart attack. While he was in the ICU, my best friend and I stole her dad's car, and we wrapped it around a tree. My mom ended up having to leave one hospital and come to another. My grandpa ended up going into a coma and stayed in one for 3 years. My granny decided to take him home and care for him herself. So my mom ended up being gone almost every single night and every weekend, being with her to take care of him. Although my mom didn't defend me much to my stepdad, I lost all hope for anyone defending me. My stepfather ended up grounding me to my room with no electricity for 8 months because we stole the car, only to use the restroom, take a shower, and eat. So at that point, it was me, my stepdad, my brother, and sister. As a child, I felt like my stepfather had it out for me and only me. He treated and punished me way differently than he did my brother and my sister, which is his only biological child. We were constantly at each other's throats. Although I'm guilty in some aspects, I was a child and he was an adult. I needed someone to wrap their arms around me and tell me that they loved me and that everything was going to be okay. Instead, I felt alone and pushed out. So not only was I not enough for my own father, I wasn't enough for the man who was supposed to be the father figure in my life. I began looking for love and affection elsewhere. At no surprise, I ended up in a very abusive relationship. I ended up pregnant at the age of 17 and was convinced by my mother and her friends that my life would be better if I aborted the baby. As much as I didn't want to, I felt like I had no choice. So my mom took me to the bank to cash my bonds that my grandpa had given me. And unfortunately, we went through with it. This was such a traumatizing experience for me. I wanted my baby, and I wanted to love something and give them what I never had. I shortly moved out with my boyfriend, and 22 days after I turned 19, I gave birth to Emma. Some may call her my redemption child. I knew more than anything I wanted to be a mother, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me this time. I wanted to make sure I was enough for her. After having her, I went into postpartum depression pretty bad. The father of my child mentally abused me every single day. He tore me down to where I felt like I was nothing. The free-spirited loudmouth that I once was and am today was long gone. I did everything in my power to make sure he was happy and worried about nothing about my own happiness. After 5 years of enduring mental abuse, Jonathan walked into my life. I wish I could say that was my fairy tale ending, but it wasn't. It took quite some time to get my daughter's father out of my life. It's interesting how roles can change when you decide to leave someone. I remember a night where he was on his knees with his arms wrapped around my legs, crying, begging for me not to leave him, crying to not break his family apart, to not allow our daughter to grow up in a broken home like the both of us did. I can honestly say that was one of the hardest things I had to do. Knowing that there was a chance my daughter was going to grow up in the same kind of circumstances I did. I always told myself I wasn't ever going to do that to her. She was never going to have a stepfather. But I walked away that night and never returned. As much heartbreak as it caused, I had to find myself again. I was sick of walking around with a fake smile on my face, trying to make people believe everything in my life was perfect. So about 3 months after I met John, we moved in together. Barely even knowing him, I had faith that this was it. I had finally found a man to treat me with respect, to love me like I had never been loved before. Soon after, I started to realize something wasn't right. I honestly thought John had some kind of mental disorder because he was happy one minute and mad the next. Suddenly, he didn't have half of his money for the bills and was broke on payday. Anyone that knows me knows that I'm kind of crazy and an investigator. So one night, he was passed out on the couch and wouldn't wake up. And I kept trying to wake him up repeatedly and he wouldn't budge. I somehow rolled him over and got his wallet and his phone out of his pocket. I somehow, I don't remember how, hacked his bank account, and he had just gotten paid that day and his bank account said zero. As I was looking at the transactions, he had withdrew all of his money and had no money in his wallet. I remember my heart sinking and wondering who I was even living with. Shortly after that incident, I received a phone call at work that my two stepkids, Miley and Vince, were most likely going to come live with us. There had been a situation with their mom, and he was going to fight for full custody. Honestly, that situation with me thinking that John was doing something wrong went to the back of my head. He was about to go into a custody battle, and I was going to make sure I was right by his side to win. About 3 months later, at the age of 22, I went from being a mother of one to a mother of three. Ages 3, 3, and 4. I never even second-guessed it. After the custody battle died down, things started to get worse with John. He would leave and stay gone for all hours of the night. And I thought to myself, I didn't just help you get custody of your children so you could go out and party while I sat at home with 3 kids. Soon after that, I remember sitting in the parking lot of my work, and I tried to call John, and he didn't answer. So the craziness in me decided to check his voicemails. I heard this message. Hey, Johnny, it's Pastor Jim. I got your message. Give me a call sometime. It's been a long time. I thought to myself, this dude must have the wrong number because John doesn't know any pastors. A couple days later, John told me, my old friend Pastor Jim is coming over tonight to talk to us. I couldn't tell him that I checked his voicemail, so I had to kind of act dumb. I initially thought, I don't want to talk to any pastors. I knew nothing about God. I mean, absolutely nothing. I think I remember being in a church one time my entire life. I didn't want to talk to him. He ended up coming over, and we had a great conversation. That next week, John said, I think we should go to church. I said, I'm not walking into church. Again, I knew nothing about God, and I wasn't going to sit in a church so people could judge me. I thought for the longest time, God hated me and was punishing me for aborting my baby. How could he forgive me? I didn't blame him. We ended up going again and again. I thought to myself, this isn't too bad. I felt like that's where I was supposed to be. I thought things were going to start looking up for John and I, but I was wrong. Things got worse. By this time, I had found pills in his pockets, so I knew exactly what was going on. He tried to convince me many times he was clean, and even once got down and proposed to me, but that didn't last long when he took the ring back and returned it and went on a 3-day party binge. Once again, that fake smile was back on my face, and I was alone again. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell anyone. I didn't want anyone to know I was in yet another crappy relationship. I started to pray, although I had no idea how to pray. I just remember asking God to help me repeatedly. Then one snowy day, John decided to take all of our kids sledding. I remember saying to him, oh, I'll come, that'll be fun. He said, no, why don't you stay home and have some time to yourself? Well, we could pass that up, right? After they got home, I was getting my daughter ready for bed. She had made a comment about going to John's friend's house that day. And when I asked her what friend, she said, I don't know. We stayed in the car. John just went in. I completely lost it. I put all my kids to bed, shut their doors, and I think I literally lost my mind. He had taken my children to a drug house and left them in a car. That was it for me. We were in the kitchen screaming at each other. I was in complete and utter shock. I remember the argument getting heated more and more, and then he pushed me. I could never forget the evil in his eyes that night. I laid on the couch, curled in a ball, hysterically crying. What had my life come to? Why was I not enough for anyone? What was I going to do? I couldn't afford to live on my own, so I convinced myself the next day I was going to call my mom and ask her to come back home. I wrote John a long letter that night and said I was leaving him and that I wasn't going to live like this any longer. That pain that night was so unreal. I was going to have to leave Miley and Vince, and I had to leave them with him. I was going to have to go back to my parents, although that was the last place I wanted to be. The next morning, John went to work, and as I was trying to figure out exactly what I needed to do and where do I start, when my phone rang, and it was Pastor Jim. He said, well, I guess Johnny needs some help. I was in shock because no one around us knew what was going on. He said, Johnny is on his way home from work. I'm coming to get him, and we're going to get him into rehab. Don't do anything yet. Everything is going to be okay. Soon after, John walked through the doors with tears streaming down his face. and he hit his knees, saying he was sorry and begging me not to leave. I didn't think I could do it anymore. I remember texting Jim and saying I couldn't do it. I couldn't continue to put myself and my children through this. His response was, have faith and love him. He needs you to love him through this. Love him and have faith? What about someone loving me? And how do I even have faith in someone? I don't even know what that means. So this wasn't in here, but I just remembered this morning, one of the times that right afterwards, Jill had come to our house. And as soon as she walked in right after, she walked over to John and gave him a huge hug. And I'm like, what is she doing? Like, why is she giving him a hug? Like, aren't you mad? Like, and I just remember she was giving him grace. Like, she believed in him, and that wasn't something that I ever saw or experienced in my life. And honestly, if it wasn't for Jim and Jill at that time, I don't think we would be where we are today, because they never gave up on us. And I know God is the ultimate reason why, but I remember multiple times that John would want to leave and Jim would say, you're not going anywhere by yourself. I'll be there in 15 minutes to get you, and I'll take you. And I couldn't thank them enough for doing that for us. But I ended up staying and can happily say he's been clean ever since that day. I had learned I had to have faith in John until he could have faith in himself again. It wasn't easy, but someone got us through it, and that was God. We started going to church every Sunday, and I started to learn more and more about the Word, accepted Jesus into my life, and got baptized. We ended up going to a Bible study at Jim and Jill's called Love and Respect. One night, we were going into great depth on the importance of marriage. I was blown away at how God viewed marriage. I remember asking question after question. God was absolutely in the room that night. It was so powerful, amazing, and indescribable. I just knew it was nothing but God. He convicted both John and I that night. We needed to get married. Now, I was always that girl that dreamed of having her fairy tale wedding and expected nothing but that. No way I would ever just run and get married. I had to have my day. Maybe we would do it in a year or so. But by the end of the night, John and I were calling Jim and Jill, telling them we wanted to get married in ASAP. A few days later, in front of a few of our loved ones, that's exactly what we did right here in this room. That day, my life changed for the better. I learned to forgive. I learned to love and what it felt like to be loved. I learned my value was immeasurable. I thought for the longest time I wasn't enough to keep my father alive. I wasn't enough for my mother and stepfather, and I wasn't enough to keep my husband off drugs. I had to learn I was enough. Christ would have died just for me. Christ is enough to make any girl a princess and any bum a prince. This is a picture of my stepfather and I. And after we started going to church, I learned to forgive him. And we still don't have the relationship that we should, but we have some sort of a relationship, which is great.
I don't have a whole lot to say. It's interesting sitting here listening to my wife talk about, my addiction and everything that's happened in our lives. One thing I want to say about this picture, Terry, is he's become one of the most amazing men I know. It's amazing what a little forgiveness can do in our lives. It won't, it's not only going to change our lives, it's going to change the person that we forgive. and that absolutely did that with Terry and Jessica, and now they're close and they have a great relationship. And as far as my addiction, everything I put you through, I'm sorry. I can never say it enough. You are enough for me, and I just want you to know that. I love you. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that was 2 Corinthians 12:9. And this is just today. Jesus is enough for her in the same way he is enough for me, and he is enough for all of you as well. So I encourage each and every one of you, if you have a story, talk to Pastor Jim about it, and maybe you guys can get up here and talk about it. That's all I have. How about you? Yeah.
I'm sorry. Band, you guys can come on up. I don't have really anything to say except that Jess probably gave me way too much credit. I've known John since he was 15, and there was a period of time when he left and got it all tatted up. I had nothing to do with the tattoos. He did that on his own. But I think that, Christ in any one of us is enough, right? And so when I knew John when he was young, in fact, funny story. I was out playing golf with one of my buddies on the base one day, and I hit a fat shot. He said, "That's fat as your prom date." And I'm like, that's funny. And then a few weeks later, Johnny was out playing golf with us, and he hit a fat shot, and I said, "That's as fat as your prom date." And he said, "I went to the prom with your daughter." So I had forgotten about that. So I have known him a really long time. Anyway, my point is that when Johnny really got... by the way, I'm the only one who calls him Johnny. I don't know. I made that up. I think that Christ in us, when people see that genuine thing, when they really need help, that's where they'll reach back out to. And so I encourage you, first of all, to just continue to fight the good fight. And even though you're going through trouble, people will see the real thing in you is real, and they'll reach back out to it. I got nothing else to say, so let's let the band do their thing.